Killing Lincoln by Bill O'Reilly, Martin Dugard, published in 2011. Part 1, Total War. The narrative opens by revealing that Lincoln has only 6 weeks left to live. As he is sworn in for his second term, he delivers a powerful speech that contrasts sharply with the hostile, alcohol-fueled address given by Vice President Andrew Johnson. While the Civil War continues, many in the North, including Johnson, demand severe punishment for the South's rebellion. However, Lincoln's speech focuses on reconciliation, emphasizing forgiveness with the words, "with malice toward none." Despite Lincoln's eloquence, not everyone is moved. Among the crowd stands John Wilkes Booth, fuming with rage as he listens to the president's words. Though he is unarmed and accompanied by his fiancée, Lucy Hale, Booth's fury nearly gets the best of him. As Lincoln passes by, Booth suddenly lunges, but a policeman intervenes. Booth quickly fabricates an excuse, claiming he simply lost his balance. The author notes that just as Lincoln remains committed to reuniting the nation, Booth remains determined to bring him harm. Part 1, Chapter 1 Summary, Saturday, April 1, 1865 City Point, Virginia. The chapter begins with President Lincoln, just 14 days away from his assassination, pacing the deck of the steamboat River Queen. Despite the gunfire echoing around him and the fact that the boat is docked at City Point, a Virginia port infiltrated by Confederates, he shows no fear of potential snipers. The artillery fire he hears is part of a strategy to tighten the perimeter around Petersburg, paving the way for General Ulysses S. Grant's troops to overtake the city, which has resisted Union attacks for 10 months. If successful, Grant will trap Confederate General Robert E. Lee and force his surrender, effectively ending the 4-year-long Civil War. However, uncertainty looms over what will happen next. Lincoln is aware of Lee's skill in avoiding capture and suspects that he will attempt to break through Union defenses and flee toward North Carolina. At this stage, some Confederate soldiers disguise themselves in stolen Union uniforms, partly out of necessity, as their own clothing is in tatters, and partly to avoid capture. Lincoln understands that if Lee manages to escape, it could devastate Northern morale. War fatigue has sparked protests, and some question Lincoln's leadership. An escape could embolden the South to reject future surrender terms, making it feel as if they had won. To prevent this, Lincoln instructs Grant to offer Lee the most lenient surrender terms possible, ensuring that Confederate soldiers will not be punished. He believes that the nation needs people to rebuild, not prisoners of war. Despite the challenges, Lincoln remains committed to reconciliation. Although his advisors insist that assassination is not something Americans do, Lincoln is not so sure, especially as the war nears its conclusion. Nonetheless, he places his trust in God. That night, he falls asleep and experiences a powerful dream, one that will later shock those he shares it with. Part 1, Chapter 2 Summary, Sunday, April 2, 1865 Petersburg, Virginia. While the Civil War is often framed as a conflict between the North and South, for the people of Petersburg, Virginia, it is a battle between Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The two have been engaged in a strategic standoff for 11 months, with Grant holding the advantage. Both seek control of Petersburg, a 200-year-old city located just 23 miles from the Confederate capital of Richmond. The situation began in June when Grant executed one of history's greatest military maneuvers, retreating from Cold Harbor with 115,000 troops and marching toward Petersburg without losing a single soldier. At that time, Petersburg was unguarded, presenting Grant with an opportunity to seize it. However, his commanders failed to capitalize on their position, allowing Lee to reinforce the city and prolong the conflict. Had Grant's forces surrounded Petersburg then, they could have initiated a full siege. A key reason for the prolonged battle is the Appomattox River, which runs through the city and serves as a natural barrier for Lee's army while enabling Confederate supply trains to operate uninterrupted. This allows high-ranking Confederate officers, including Lee, to maintain a semblance of normal life. Lee even attends church regularly. His commanders, A.P. Hill and John B. Gordon, oversee the city's defenses, but Lee's forces are dwindling. His army has been reduced to 50,000 men, with only 35,000 fit for battle. Despite their struggles, they have managed to repel Grant's attacks. Lee is aware, however, that victory at Petersburg is impossible. His soldiers are dying from starvation and disease at an alarming rate. Some, unable to endure the suffering, secretly surrender at night just for the chance to eat. The remaining troops are near their breaking point. To keep his army intact, Lee considers two options: retreating to Richmond or attempting to break through Union lines and head south. Either strategy would allow them to escape to the Carolinas, where reinforcements and much-needed supplies await. However, Grant eliminates Lee's chance to push through Union forces when, on April 1, the Confederate Army suffers a crushing defeat at the Battle of Five Forks. General Phil Sheridan captures a key crossroads leading to North Carolina, dealing a significant blow to Confederate General George Pickett, the same commander who failed at Gettysburg. The battle results in nearly 3,000 Confederate casualties and is described as the most lopsided Union victory of the war. Following this, Grant launches another offensive, which accounts for the loud artillery fire Lincoln heard from the River Queen the previous day. After an intense bombardment, 100,000 Union troops storm Lee's defenses, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Generals G. Parke and Horatio Wright inflict heavy losses on Lee's already depleted forces. Wright, employing innovative tactics learned at West Point, leads an assault that decimates A.P. Hill's Third Corps. Wright later gains recognition for his work on the Washington Monument and Brooklyn Bridge. In under 2 hours, his soldiers advance deep into Petersburg. However, they move so far ahead of the rest of the Union Army that they must pause and wait for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Lee and his commanders, Hill and Pete Longstreet, watch from Lee's headquarters as Union troops push forward. Lee realizes that if he doesn't act swiftly, Richmond will fall as well. He dresses in his finest uniform, preparing for the possibility of surrender. In the midst of the chaos, Lee must complete 3 critical tasks: retreat to Petersburg, instruct his generals to hold the city's defenses until the last soldier is safe or nightfall arrives, and then evacuate to the Carolinas. Although his troops are weak and starving, they remain a formidable force in open combat, and Lee believes they can leverage this advantage during the retreat. If any of these steps fail, surrender will be inevitable. Fortunately for Lee, Wright's troops fail to recognize him. Had they realized his identity, they would have attacked and captured him, effectively ending the war. Instead, Union soldiers hesitate when they spot an artillery battery near Lee's headquarters, the Turnbull House, mistakenly assuming it is part of a larger defensive stronghold. Reluctant to advance and risk being gunned down, they hold back. Seizing this opportunity, Lee escapes. By nightfall, he crosses the Appomattox River and orders his army to follow, setting in motion the war's final chase. Part 1, Chapter 3 Summary, Monday, April 3, 1865, Petersburg, Virginia. Lee's withdrawal from Petersburg is slow and disorderly, so much so that Confederate troops are still visible retreating more than 8 hours later. Grant has the opportunity to pursue them and inflict heavy losses, but he chooses not to. He recognizes that these same soldiers, husbands, fathers, and sons, will be essential in rebuilding the nation after the war. However, he later regrets this decision. Lee aims to reach Amelia Courthouse, where he believes food and supplies await his army. However, he will soon face a Union force of 100,000 men. Grant intends to use this moment to deliver the final blow and capture Lee's army. Grant, stationed in Petersburg, sends a telegram to Lincoln at City Point, requesting a meeting. The city of Petersburg is now deserted, and Grant waits for news of Richmond's fall. In many ways, he is the opposite of Lee. While Lee was already a highly respected war hero, Grant had been a low-ranking officer responsible for supplies. Despite this, Grant gained valuable military experience. Lee had once scolded him for his unkempt appearance, considering it unacceptable for a soldier. Grant also has connections to several key Confederate figures, including James Pete Longstreet, who had been the best man at his wedding but now fights for Lee, and Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. As he awaits news of Richmond's surrender, Grant smokes his signature cigars, an indulgence that will eventually cost him his life. Both he and Lincoln believe that losing Richmond will hasten the Confederacy's downfall. Lincoln arrives with a small group, including his 11-year-old son. He constantly puts himself in dangerous situations, despite knowing that the final days of a war are prime opportunities for an assassination attempt. While he worries about the fate of the country, he gives little thought to his own safety. As he enters Petersburg, freed slaves gather to greet him. Lincoln then meets with Grant, a leader he deeply values in the war effort. After their discussion, they part ways. Grant will go on to become president, while Lincoln will focus on unifying the nation, though his efforts will ultimately cost him his life. Lincoln returns to City Point, once again exposing himself to danger. As he walks across a battlefield strewn with the dead, he does not avert his gaze, instead feeling a sense of guilt. He knows that even some Northerners resent him for the war's prolonged devastation. When he arrives back at City Point, he receives the long-awaited news: Richmond has fallen. Overjoyed, Lincoln is grateful to have witnessed this moment, unaware that he has only 12 days left to live. Part 1, Chapter 4 Summary, Tuesday, April 4, 1865 Newport, Rhode Island. John Wilkes Booth secretly travels to Rhode Island with his fiancée, Lucy Hale. Newport has long been a retreat for the wealthy, dating back to the Revolutionary War. Booth comes from a large family, one of 8 children. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a dramatic and eccentric man who left his wife and 2 children in England to run away to America with a British woman, Booth's mother. Both his father and brother achieved greater success than Booth, fueling his feelings of anger and resentment. During his journey to Rhode Island, Booth is bombarded with news of Richmond's fall and Jefferson Davis's escape. With the Confederacy crumbling, he becomes more convinced that he alone must take action to avenge the South. His hatred for Lincoln has been growing, particularly since the Emancipation Proclamation. While recovering from an illness, he began assembling a group to kidnap Lincoln, recruiting friends Michael O'Laughlin and Samuel Arnold in August 1864. In October, he traveled to meet with agents connected to Jefferson Davis, who had over $1 million in gold stored in Montreal to fund Confederate espionage efforts. These meetings tied Booth to the Confederacy and to Confederate sympathizers like Samuel Mudd and John Surratt, both of whom would play key roles in his plot against Lincoln. Booth continued to network with secret operatives and influential figures, solidifying his plan to abduct the president. Outside of the secessionist movement, no one is aware of Booth's schemes, including his fiancée, Lucy Hale. Their engagement is a secret, and they have spent little time together. Lucy's father is a powerful pro-Union senator who would never approve of their relationship. She and Booth are well matched in their shared vanity, and she has many admirers, including Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's son. However, she remains oblivious to Booth's secret meetings and his involvement with prostitutes. Booth, once again, launches into a pro-Confederate tirade, angered by the fact that the North has been largely untouched by war, but Lucy is politically astute and challenges him, forcing them to change the subject before their argument escalates. Booth deeply loves Lucy and sees her as the love of his life. In fact, she is the only thing keeping him from carrying out his dangerous plans. That night, they return to their hotel and make love, but both sense that their relationship has been permanently fractured. Booth also realizes that Lucy is the last remaining obstacle between him and his mission. As they board a train to Boston and go their separate ways, he feels a sense of relief, knowing he is now free to move forward with his deadly intentions. Part 1, Chapter 5 Summary, Tuesday, April 4, 1865 Amelia Courthouse, Virginia. As Booth and Lucy Hale travel to Boston, Lee's army pushes forward toward Amelia Courthouse. With an 8-hour lead on Grant, Lee hopes to regroup and feed his exhausted troops with the promised rations awaiting them at their destination. Although Jefferson Davis has already fled, Lee believes that replenishing his men will put them in a better position to face Grant's advancing forces. The journey spans 40 miles and takes about a day and a half, but it quickly turns into a grueling march of death. The soldiers, already weak and malnourished, begin to desert. The 20-mile column of retreating troops is dotted with patches of blue as many wear scavenged Union uniforms due to their own tattered clothing. The situation is even worse for those fleeing from Richmond, many of them sailors and civilians unfamiliar with the hardships of marching. Lee receives news that the bridges from Petersburg have been destroyed, preventing Grant from following directly behind. This gives Lee a renewed sense of urgency to reach Amelia Courthouse. Though he suspects that Grant is maneuvering west to block his next move, Lee remains confident that his army can hold its own in open battle. His determination spreads among his men, and the weary soldiers arrive at Amelia Courthouse just before noon, feeling a surge of hope. However, their relief turns to despair when they discover that the boxcars, which were supposed to be filled with much-needed food, contain only ammunition. Part 1, Chapter 6 Summary, Tuesday, April 4, 1865 Richmond, Virginia. While John Wilkes Booth remains in Newport and General Robert E. Lee reaches Amelia Courthouse with Grant closing in, Lincoln sails toward Richmond aboard the Malvern. The ship navigates treacherous waters riddled with anti-ship mines. Despite the dangers, Lincoln is eager to reach Richmond, though the city has been reduced to ruins by its own residents. When the ship can go no further, Lincoln and his bodyguard, William Crook, disembark to continue on foot. The author notes that Richmond citizens never expected the city to fall, and when it did, chaos erupted. The first target of destruction was the alcohol supply, as Southerners feared a repeat of what happened in South Carolina, where Union soldiers burned a city after becoming drunk. Next, food supplies, including the rations meant for Lee's troops at Amelia Courthouse, were looted by Confederate robbers. The tobacco reserves were also set on fire to prevent Lincoln from selling them to the British, but this act backfired as the burning tobacco spread to surrounding buildings, sparking a massive blaze. The situation worsened when the Confederate Navy set its own ships ablaze to prevent their capture by Union forces. The explosions from the ships sent shells raining down on the panicked crowds, resulting in hundreds of casualties. Richmond, the author emphasizes, was a city deeply rooted in American history, perhaps even more so than Washington, D.C. It was here, in 1775, that Patrick Henry famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," to an audience that included Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. When Union troops enter the city, they do so without resistance, as Confederate landmines remain marked with red flags. They are greeted by freed slaves, many of whom are astonished to see black soldiers among the ranks. A flag bearing 36 stars, symbolizing the newly admitted state of Nevada, is raised over the city, representing the reunified nation Lincoln had always envisioned. Ironically, just 11 days later, a similar flag will be draped near Lincoln's head after he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Part 1, Chapter 7 Summary, Tuesday, April 4, 1865, Richmond, Virginia. Abraham Lincoln walks through the streets of Richmond, welcomed by freed slaves yet met with hostile glares from many of the city's white residents. His towering height makes him an easy target for anyone seeking vengeance, but he strides forward, unconcerned. He makes his way to the former home of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president who has since fled. Lincoln has no interest in pursuing Davis or prosecuting Confederate leaders for war crimes. His sole focus is reuniting the country. Now that Richmond has fallen, all that remains is for Grant to secure final victory so the difficult work of rebuilding the nation can begin. Part 1, Chapter 8 Summary, Wednesday, April 5, 1865, Amelia Courthouse, Virginia, noon to midnight. Lee and his army are in a state of desperation. The only thing keeping the soldiers going is the hope of finding food, but desertions are rampant as many soldiers eventually make it home months later, though many die from starvation along the way. Even Lee is defeated, and though he sends out wagons to search for food, nothing is found. The soldiers resort to eating anything, even spoiled food, and pack animals are slaughtered. Realizing the army's situation, Lee knows they must move again before Grant finds them. His plan is to march 100 miles south to Danville, where he could surrender to Grant, but his pride won't let him give up yet. Lee orders the army to move, but a Union blockade halts them. He contemplates charging the Union forces in a final attack but ultimately decides to protect his men. Instead of engaging, he reroutes the army westward to Painaville. The Union cavalry continues to harass Lee's retreating forces, burning wagons and attacking the rear. Lee orders his soldiers to counterattack, and despite their hardships, they manage to inflict casualties on the Union cavalry, showing that they still have the will to fight. The march is grueling, and the army's numbers are halved, but when it comes time for battle, Lee knows his soldiers will find the strength to fight for the South's cause. Eventually, Lee receives a message from Grant ordering an attack at dawn, but he also learns that food and supplies are waiting at Farmville, so he turns his army in that direction, hoping to restock before continuing. Part 1, Chapter 9 Summary, Wednesday, April 5, 1865, Jetersville, Virginia, night. Grant is pushing forward at full speed, determined to catch Lee before he can reach Farmville. Word has come that Lee is heading there to restock his army with rations. If Lee can get to High Bridge, a stone would structure crucial for his retreat, and burn it behind him, his escape will be assured, and the war will drag on. Grant is aware of the urgency. This is the moment to capture Lee, and he is determined to do so himself. But Lee continues to thwart Grant's plans, always staying one step ahead. Grant is frustrated, particularly with some of his top generals. Despite having a better prepared army, they are not meeting his expectations. While he has no concerns about General Phil Sheridan, who commands the cavalry, Grant is irritated with General George Meade. Meade defied a direct order to attack Lee's rear at Jetersville, claiming his army was too tired. Grant knows this stems from internal friction between the infantry and cavalry, who often look down on each other. Sheridan, upset by Meade's refusal, has told Grant about the incident, adding to the tension. Grant is confident in his army's superiority, especially since they've grown stronger since the capture of Petersburg. He and Sheridan discuss their battle strategy, and even though Meade claims he is too sick to meet with Grant, Grant insists that he prepare his men for battle anyway. Though Meade is a hero of Gettysburg for his critical victory, Grant knows his infantry will not catch up with Lee's fast-moving forces. The key to success will be a swift attack, much like Sheridan's cavalry, which is positioned to outmaneuver Lee. The plan is for Meade's infantry to catch up with Lee, harassing his retreating forces, while Sheridan races ahead to get in front of Lee and cut him off. Part 1, Chapter 10 Summary, Thursday, April 6, 1865 Rice's Station, Virginia, dawn. As Lee and his army retreat to Rice's Station, the mood is one of weary determination. It has been 4 days since they left Petersburg, and though their ranks are thinned and their spirits tested, the soldiers still rally to their commander. Lee, accompanied by his trusted generals, Pete Longstreet and John B. Gordon, arrives at the small hamlet, which offers a critical crossroads for his army. One road leads toward the safety of the Carolinas, the other back to Petersburg, which is now out of reach. Lee knows that this moment is critical. His army's survival depends on their ability to get provisions in Farmville and then cross High Bridge. With Union forces closing in, however, time is running out. Lee orders his artillery placed on the road to deter any Union forces attempting to pursue. His plan is for Longstreet's army to hold Rice's Station until the rest of Lee's forces have evacuated. Once they reach Farmville, they will restock and move forward toward High Bridge, but a major obstacle looms. Union cavalry is known to be heading for the bridge, with orders to destroy it before Lee's men can cross. At this point, Lee is uncertain. The stakes couldn't be higher. Without the bridge, the Confederate retreat is doomed. With the Union cavalry racing to burn it, Lee turns to Longstreet for advice. Longstreet quickly formulates a plan. General Thomas Lafayette Rosser, who has just arrived at Rice's Station with his cavalry, will be tasked with dealing with the Union threat. Rosser, a skilled and eager fighter who is known for his past successes in battles like Bull Run and Gettysburg, is just the man for the job. Longstreet knows that Rosser's energy and experience make him the ideal candidate for this desperate mission. Lee, knowing the outcome of this mission could determine the fate of the Confederate army, rests while his generals put the plan into motion. He can only wait, fully aware that his options are narrowing, and that the Union cavalry's next move will be decisive. If the bridge is lost, his retreat will be cut off, and the war for the Confederacy will effectively be over. Part 1, Chapter 11 Summary, Thursday, April 6, 1865 Farmville, Virginia, mid-morning. The Union force, led by Colonel Washburn, faces the daunting task of destroying High Bridge before Lee's army can make its escape. The bridge, a marvel of engineering with its brick column supports, is crucial for Lee's retreat. With a force of 79 cavalrymen and 800 infantry, Washburn's men are tasked with taking down the bridge, but they are severely outnumbered by the Confederate forces that are waiting to intercept them. Washburn and General Theodore Red survey the situation from Chatham Plateau, where they can see the bridge in full view. They know that the Confederate defenders have been stationed there for months, but still, the attack proceeds, even though it's clear the mission is fraught with peril. Washburn, eager to end the war and cut off Lee's retreat, leads his cavalry toward High Bridge, but they're soon harried by Confederate cavalry, who lure them into traps and ambushes. Washburn is within striking distance of the bridge when its defenders fire on his men, halting the advance. At this critical moment, Washburn is torn. He knows that destroying the bridge could bring an end to the war, but when he hears gunfire from behind, signaling that Confederate forces have caught up to his infantry, he turns back to join the fight. Unfortunately, his force is outnumbered. An estimated 1,200 Confederate cavalrymen lie in wait, ready to launch a full-scale attack. Washburn decides on a bold tactic to try to break through. He orders his cavalrymen to charge, attacking with both sabers drawn and gunfire from their saddles. For a brief moment, this show of force disorients the Confederate lines. Washburn creates a gap in the enemy's defenses, hoping his infantry will rush through the hole and make it to safety, eventually linking up with Grant's army. However, to his dismay, the infantry stays behind, not following the plan. The delay allows Confederate forces to regroup, and General Rosser orders a counterattack. What follows is a brutal and chaotic battle. Union soldiers, caught off guard and with no chance of escape, are decimated by the Confederate cavalry. The tide of battle shifts rapidly, and General Deering, one of the Confederate commanders, personally shoots and kills General Reed. In retaliation, Washburn attacks Deering, but the Union commander is gravely injured in the process, shot in the face, his jaw hanging loose. He is knocked off his horse and, before he can recover, is sabred in the head. Remarkably, Washburn survives, but only just. He is found the following day on the battlefield, badly wounded, but alive. The aftermath of the battle is devastating. The Confederate forces lose around 100 men, while the Union side is decimated, with 847 soldiers lost. The mission to burn High Bridge fails, and Washburn's force is nearly wiped out, demonstrating the brutal cost of trying to strike a decisive blow in the final days of the war. Part 1, Chapter 12 Summary, Thursday, April 6, 1865, on the road to Farmville, Virginia, afternoon. As General Robert E. Lee continues his retreat, the Union forces, now led by General Meade, continue to harry his rear with skirmishes that keep Lee's army on edge. These constant attacks serve to weaken the Confederate lines, separating and disorienting the retreating forces. Lee, in a critical miscalculation, believes that Union cavalry forces, particularly those led by General Phil Sheridan, have moved ahead of him and are much larger than he anticipated. This assumption leads him to hold his position at Rice's Station, thinking he is under more immediate threat than he really is. While Lee holds his forces in place, General Sheridan's subordinates, Generals Custer, Thomas Devon, and George Crook, are pushing forward, relentlessly searching for Lee's army. Among them, General George Armstrong Custer is particularly notable for his brash, impulsive behavior. Known for his flamboyance and tendency to act without waiting for reinforcements, Custer's decision-making style will eventually lead to his downfall at the Battle of Little Bighorn, 11 years later. But for now, his risk-taking pays off. Custer learns of a gap in Lee's retreating forces and, without hesitation, charges forward with his cavalry, attacking Lee's lines at Marshall's Crossroads. Despite being without reinforcements, Custer's boldness works in his favor. He succeeds in his assault, and the Confederate forces at Marshall's Crossroads are severely weakened. With the help of Generals Devon and Crook, the Union forces lay waste to the Confederate forces, and of the 3,000 rebels, only about 600 managed to escape. The Union soldiers, now emboldened, chase down the fleeing Confederates, rounding them up in the woods, capturing many as prisoners. Among those captured is General Richard Ewell, a high-ranking Confederate officer. Ewell, knowing his forces are in dire straits, realizes that a band of his men are cornered on a stream known as Sailor's Creek. This group of Confederate soldiers, determined to fight to the bitter end, prepares for what will become one of the most brutal and intense battles of the war, a battle that will be remembered as the most barbaric and ferocious of the entire war. The Confederates, outnumbered and exhausted, face overwhelming Union forces in this final, desperate stand. The battle at Sailor's Creek becomes a scene of horrific combat, with the Confederate soldiers fighting with all their might, knowing the end of the war is near. Yet, despite their ferocity, the Union forces, buoyed by superior numbers and relentless pursuit, will ultimately prevail. Part 1, Chapter 13 Summary, Thursday, April 6, 1865 at Sailor's Creek, late afternoon. The battle at Sailor's Creek stands as one of the most brutal confrontations of the Civil War, marking the final, desperate efforts of General Robert E. Lee's army to escape Union forces and prolong the Confederacy's fight. Set in a place of remarkable beauty, the scene becomes one of devastation and loss. Lee's men, exhausted and demoralized after weeks of retreat, find themselves trapped at Sailor's Creek with no easy path of escape. The Confederate army, already stricken with fatigue, is trying to cross double bridges over Big Sailor's Creek and Little Sailor's Creek. The creek's beauty contrasts sharply with the chaos that erupts as soon as the Union army appears in the distance. Panic quickly spreads through the Confederate ranks as their wagons become clogged and the narrow road is blocked, halting their movement. The momentary paralysis sets the stage for the Union attack, which is swift and overwhelming. The Confederate forces make a last stand near the creek, holding the high ground for a brief moment of hope. Their position on the mound gives them a tactical advantage, as Union forces would need to cross the creek and march uphill to engage them. But despite this advantage, the Confederate soldiers are demoralized, and when the Union artillery begins to shell their position, it takes a toll on their resolve. Yet, they continue to hold the hill, and when Union soldiers approach under fire, they open up a deadly volley, killing many of the Union attackers and sending the rest scrambling for cover. For a moment, it seems like the Confederates might be able to repel the assault. But the Union forces, including Custer's cavalry, regroup and charge again. This time, the Confederate soldiers cannot hold their ground. The Union soldiers, emboldened by their numbers and the resolve of their leaders, close in on the hill. As the fight becomes hand-to-hand, the brutality of the battle becomes clear. The battlefield is filled with horrific violence, close combat, dismemberment, and the vicious determination of both sides to secure victory at any cost. Despite the fierce resistance, the Union army ultimately overwhelms the remaining Confederate forces. With no reinforcements and no chance for retreat, Lee's men are forced to surrender, marking the end of the battle. Lee, though devastated by the loss, still refuses to surrender outright. He retreats with his remaining 8,000 soldiers, leaving behind thousands of his men dead or captured. The Union Army suffers 1,200 casualties, but their victory is significant. 56 Union soldiers are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their actions at Sailor's Creek, though the battle itself is largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the eventual fall of the Confederacy. As the Confederate soldiers are rounded up, many of them begin to realize the war is almost over. They are exhausted, defeated, and broken, but Lee, even in the face of this overwhelming defeat, refuses to submit to the inevitable. The Confederacy's last hopes are slipping away, and it is only a matter of time before Lee will have no choice but to surrender. The battle at Sailor's Creek serves as a brutal reminder of the horrors of war, where the lines between heroism and savagery blur, and men on both sides fight not for glory, but simply for survival. Part 1, Chapter 14 Summary, Friday, April 7, 1865 City Point, Virginia, dawn. In Richmond, Lincoln waits for updates on the war, with his wife, Mary Todd, and a group of tourists. He eventually hears from Grant about the day's victories and realizes that Lee is likely to surrender if they continue to push. Lincoln responds, "Let the thing be pressed." Part 1, Chapter 15 Summary, Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's forces are trapped by Grant's 60,000 men after a series of unsuccessful attempts to escape. Lee, with only 8,000 men left, tries one last attack but realizes it is futile and agrees to meet Grant. Though Lee would rather die than surrender, he knows it's the only option left. Grant prepares for the surrender and meets Lee at a designated location. When Lee arrives, he is told to wait while Grant is found. He asks for a delay in the Union attack so that he can meet with Grant, and a 60-minute truce is granted. When Grant arrives, he is disheveled, and the two exchange pleasantries, recalling their time in the Mexican War. Grant surprises Lee with his leniency, offering terms that allow the Confederate soldiers to return home and help rebuild the nation. Lee agrees to the terms, and while the two armies make peace, other parts of the South are already plotting to undo it. Part 2, The Ides of Death. Part 2, Chapter 16 Summary, Monday, April 10, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. After Lee's surrender, Washington, D.C. celebrates the end of the 4-year war, though the toll of more than 600,000 dead weighs heavily. A crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathers outside the White House, hoping to hear a speech from Lincoln. As they pass the Capitol building, which Lincoln considers a symbol of the nation's endurance, they call for him to address them. Though Lincoln is not in the mood to speak, he goes outside unprotected to retrieve his son Tad, who wants to join the celebration. Lincoln tells the crowd he will speak the next day and knows they expect a speech of retribution, but he plans to focus on reunification and leniency. He then has the band play Dixie and returns inside. Part 2, Chapter 17 Summary, Monday, April 10, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. As Dixie plays near the White House, Booth practices shooting with his derringer. With Lee's surrender, the secessionist cause is in disarray, and there are several plots against Lincoln, including 2 involving kidnapping, one involving smuggling yellow fever-infected shirts into the White House, and another to blow up the White House. Booth is part of a kidnapping plot, but, like other agents, he is bound by the rule of not engaging in black flag warfare, meaning they cannot kill anyone. However, with the South's defeat, Booth wonders if that rule still applies. Booth is portrayed as a vain, petty man who has a sense of entitlement due to his fame as an actor and his privileged background. A white supremacist, he temporarily left acting to support the pro-slavery cause. He believes slavery is a natural order and that African Americans actually welcome punishment for defying it. Booth was particularly enraged by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. For Booth, the only way to prevent a black uprising is to reinstate slavery, and the Civil War must be won to achieve that. Lee's defeat deeply affects him. Though many Confederate soldiers refuse to surrender, Booth wants to inspire them to keep fighting by kidnapping Lincoln and delivering him to the South. He has already attempted to kidnap Lincoln at his residence, Soldiers' Home, but his plan to do so during a theater performance is so outlandish that he struggles to find support. Realizing that Lincoln is now his direct enemy, Booth ultimately decides to take matters into his own hands and initiate black flag warfare. Part 2, Chapter 18 Summary, Monday, April 10, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. Booth stays at the National Hotel near Pumphrey's stable. Despite being drunk, he heads out to secure a horse, planning to ride through town and ensure a getaway after assassinating Lincoln. Booth knows that killing is immoral, but justifies it by considering himself at war, believing his actions are sanctioned. The idea that no American president has ever been assassinated intrigues him, and he feels that this act will elevate him, appealing to his vanity. The author reflects on the United States, which is soon to be 89 years old, with 36 states in the Union. Lincoln is the 16th president. A nation born from rebellion usually resolves conflicts at the ballot box, not through assassination. The only comparable incident was when Andrew Jackson was targeted by a mentally unstable person, and Congressman Davy Crockett stopped the attack. The author suggests that this may explain why Lincoln often rides alone despite the risk. Lincoln himself harbors a sense of foreboding, believing he may not survive long after the war ends, a thought shared with Harriet Beecher Stowe, who records his feeling that he won't last long in office. Booth carefully thinks through his plan, knowing that not only must he kill Lincoln, but he must also escape. He carries a map of Confederate holdouts, which he has memorized but keeps for comfort. Lincoln has only 5 days left to live. Part 2, Chapter 19 Summary, Monday, April 10, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. Booth arrives at Pumphrey's, a Confederate sympathizer, who is connected to John Surratt, another Confederate supporter involved in Booth's network. Surratt, also disillusioned by the South's defeat, keeps in touch with Booth. When Booth needs to find him, he goes to Mary Surratt's boarding house. Mary, a widow and Confederate sympathizer, is deeply involved in spying and smuggling weapons. She runs a tavern in Maryland that supports the Confederacy, and both her tavern and boarding house, along with Pumphrey's stable, serve as safe houses for individuals like Booth and the Soots. Booth plans to use the Navy Yard Bridge exit to the city, enabling him to use Mary's tavern and Dr. Samuel Mudd's house in Maryland if necessary. However, after 10 p.m. no traffic is allowed in or out of the city. He hasn't shared his plans yet but wants a horse to observe the sentries at the bridge. When his favorite horse is already rented, Booth decides to go to Ford's Theater, a new, state-of-the-art venue that once served as a church. Ford's is significant to Booth due to his background in theater. There, he speaks with Ned Spangler, a worker at the theater, and asks him to clean his buggy in preparation for sale. Booth sends his mail to Ford's and leaves his buggy there, telling Spangler he will soon leave town but doesn't specify where. The author points out the origin of the word assassin, which comes from the Hashishin group, a sect of men who worked for Persian kings between the 8th and 14th centuries, killing for rewards like hash and women. Booth, unlike them, will gain only infamy, which he is willing to accept. Part 2, Chapter 20 Summary, Tuesday, April 11, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. 2 days after Lee's surrender, Washington, D.C. is still buzzing with the aftermath, despite many still nursing hangovers. People march back to the White House, eager to hear a speech from Lincoln. Given the immense loss of life, they are expecting words of divine retribution. Booth attends the gathering with 2 co-conspirators, David Harold, a former pharmacy clerk, and Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, a former Confederate soldier turned spy. Booth has brought them to hear Lincoln's speech, though he hasn't revealed his true intentions yet. Lincoln, aware of the crowd's expectations, uses his skill as one of the greatest orators in the world to speak on unity, the freedom of slaves, and leniency for the South instead of offering promises of punishment. The crowd, disappointed by this message, begins to disperse. Booth, furious at the thought of blacks gaining citizenship, urges Powell to shoot Lincoln. Though Powell has a gun capable of killing the president, he hesitates, afraid of the mob. Booth intentionally uses Powell's hesitation to manipulate him, making Powell feel guilty and more likely to act when the time comes. Booth leaves in anger, now planning to assassinate Lincoln on April 13, the Ides of April. Part 2, Chapter 21 Summary, Tuesday, April 11, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. After Lincoln's speech, he dines with guests and Mary Lincoln, discussing dreams, including biblical ones. His somber mood alarms his wife, who notices his unease. Among the guests is the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, who has warned Lincoln for over a year about the danger to his life. Lincoln has long been the target of threats, including the Baltimore plot in 1861, which involved an attempted assassination that was foiled by the Pinkertons. Public opinion criticized Lincoln for traveling in disguise, which hurt his image, so he chose to travel openly to show that he wasn't afraid. However, he did receive police protection starting in 1864. The White House is open to the public, with people sleeping on floors, stealing curtains, and petitioning for Lincoln's attention. His staff is constantly concerned for his safety. Lincoln, however, has long been familiar with death, having lost his 3-year-old son Willie to tuberculosis and his 11-year-old son to fever. Mary, who suffers from mood swings and mental instability, adds to the family's turmoil. Lincoln rarely discusses such morbid matters, but on this night, he shares a recent dream. He recounts a vision he had aboard the River Queen, where he witnessed a funeral in the White House and realized the president had been killed. His dinner guests are horrified, and although Lincoln tries to brush it off as a joke, no one believes him. Part 2, Chapter 22 Summary, Wednesday, April 12, 1865 Washington, D.C. Morning. Booth decides to assassinate Lincoln at the theater, a venue the president frequently visits. Booth knows that Lincoln has seen him perform once, but Booth's show had been mediocre due to his anger. Despite the city being filled with returned soldiers, including hardened ones likely attending the theater, Booth remains undeterred. After the assassination, he plans to deliver the line, "Sic semper tyrannis, death always to tyrants," on stage before fleeing to Mexico. Booth walks through the city to strategize. He has settled on the idea of killing Lincoln on the Ides of April, inspired by Julius Caesar's assassination. He needs to find out which theater Lincoln will attend and which play he will see to determine the perfect moment. He also learns that Grant may be in town, which could present an opportunity to kill both Lincoln and Grant, the two leading figures responsible for the South's defeat. Booth, however, wants more. He also plans to target Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward. He assigns Lewis Powell the task of killing Seward, who is bedridden after a carriage accident. Booth recruits George Atzerodt, a drifter and carriage painter, to kill Johnson. Due to his knowledge of smuggling routes out of Washington, D.C., Atzerodt, unaware that the plot now involves murder, could be blackmailed if necessary. Though Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton is another logical target, Booth spares him. The author suggests several possible motives for this. One possibility is Stanton's connection to Lafayette Baker, a former Union spy who later shifted sides. Baker was sent to New York City after becoming distrustful of Stanton. Booth and Baker had received payments from a Canadian company, and Stanton may have stood to gain from Lincoln's assassination. Baker also tapped Stanton's phone lines, though the exact reason remains unknown. Though no definitive connection between Stanton and Booth's plot can be proven, these clues raise suspicions. Booth plans to visit Grover's Theater and Ford's Theater to scout the layouts, in case he needs to kill Lincoln at one of those locations. If not, he can still carry out the assassination at the Grand Illumination, where he can strike in a public setting. Part 2, Chapter 23 Summary, Wednesday, April 12, 1865 Washington, D.C. The chapter begins with Mary Lincoln holding a copy of Julius Caesar, which she plans to give to Lincoln in an attempt to cheer him up. Lincoln has a deep appreciation for both the Bible and Shakespeare's works, and if his mood is lifted, so too will be Mary's. They lean on each other for emotional support. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth, who is not far from the White House, is in a dark mood. There's an interesting connection between Booth and the Lincolns. Booth's fiancée, Lucy Hale, is romantically linked to Robert Todd Lincoln, the Lincolns' eldest son. Furthermore, Robert's life was once saved from a potential train accident by Edwin Booth, John's older brother. Robert's commanding officer, Ulysses S. Grant, had thanked Edwin for saving Robert. Edwin Booth had also performed in Shakespeare plays that Lincoln attended during a past season. Both Grant and Robert are expected back in Washington soon, which will likely improve Lincoln's spirits. Meanwhile, Lincoln meets with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton at the War Department. Lincoln had suggested to the Virginia legislature that they convene in Richmond with temporary powers as a gesture of goodwill. Stanton opposes this idea, warning that the South could use this opportunity to enact laws that could limit the freedom of slaves and undermine Lincoln's authority. Lincoln eventually gives in and sends a telegram to the legislature, instructing them not to meet, which satisfies Stanton. The author points out Stanton's significant role in the success of the North, and although Stanton and Lincoln were once rivals, Lincoln trusts Stanton's judgment, which is why he appointed him as Secretary of War. Additionally, the chapter notes that Lincoln was the first world leader to use telegrams for direct communication with his generals. Part 2, Chapter 24 Summary, Thursday, April 13, 1865, Washington, D.C. Morning. On the Ides of April, Booth takes a train to Baltimore to seek assistance from a former conspirator, while Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia, finally arrive in Washington, D.C. Grant, an introvert, is eager to wrap up his business in the capital and return home. The couple is exhausted after numerous delays from City Point, but they are scheduled to take part in the Grand Illumination, a citywide event where every light will be lit up. However, Grant makes the oversight of forgetting to book rooms. Used to having his staff handle such details, he finds the Willard Hotel overbooked but still manages to secure accommodations for himself and his staff. As congratulations begin to pour in, Grant and Colonel Porter freshen up and head out to meet Lincoln at the War Department. The streets are crowded with people eager to offer their congratulations and touch Grant, leading the police to escort him and Porter by carriage. Later, Grant meets with Lincoln, who congratulates him. The two take a carriage ride through the city, making plans to meet again later that night. Meanwhile, Booth and his fellow conspirators are preparing for their own deadly mission against those on their list. Part 2, Chapter 25 Summary, Thursday, April 13, 1865 Washington, D.C. Night. Booth and his fellow conspirators, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt, meet in Room 6 at the Herndon House Hotel to finalize their plans. Booth reviews the strategy with them, and the youngest conspirator, Powell, shares his progress. Powell has completed reconnaissance on Secretary of State Seward's house and even questioned a male nurse about Seward's routine to ensure he would be at home. Booth appreciates Powell's diligence but is frustrated because Lincoln will not be attending the theater that night. This means Booth will need to kill Lincoln publicly during the Grand Illumination, a far less ideal setting for his plan. As Booth goes over the details, Atzerodt begins to realize that the plot has shifted from kidnapping to murder. He's willing to help with smuggling and kidnapping, but he has no intention of killing anyone. Booth, however, blackmails Atzerodt into compliance, using his knowledge of smuggling routes into Maryland and Mexico as leverage. Atzerodt is also aware that Booth has been sharing his horse with him, which will easily tie him to the plot if he backs out now. Faced with the threat of being implicated, Atzerodt reluctantly agrees to stay involved. The four conspirators plan to remain in Washington until their mission is complete. Part 2, Chapter 26 Summary, Thursday, April 13, 1865, Washington, D.C. Night. One of Booth's former conspirators, Mike O'Laughlin, had previously been part of a plan to capture Lincoln. Booth traveled to Baltimore in an attempt to recruit him again, proposing a scheme where Lincoln would be kidnapped and lowered onto the stage of a theater. O'Laughlin had once accompanied Booth on a failed attempt to ambush Lincoln near Soldiers' Home, but he now refused to join the renewed plot. However, despite turning Booth down, O'Laughlin traveled to Washington that same day. He spent his time drinking heavily in bars, behaving erratically, and debating whether he should change his mind and help Booth. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant, who disliked social gatherings and longed to return home, was urged by his wife, Julia, to stay in Washington a bit longer. She hadn't attended a formal event in some time and wanted to at least enjoy one evening out. Grant reluctantly agreed, and the couple attended a party hosted by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. O'Laughlin, now in Washington and still uncertain about his course of action, followed them there. Though some later speculated that he had sinister intentions, his real motive was to warn Stanton and Grant about Booth's plot. However, O'Laughlin ultimately backed out of speaking to them, afraid that Booth could implicate him in their past kidnapping attempt. Instead, he left the party, continued drinking, and took no further action. That same night, Booth and his fellow conspirators were unable to locate their targets and hoped for better luck the following evening. Lincoln, suffering from a migraine, remained at the White House, but he planned to attend the theater the next night. Part 3, The Long Good Friday. Part 3, Chapter 27 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 7 a.m. Lincoln is a deeply religious man, though he never formally joins any particular Christian denomination. On Good Friday morning, he rises early and spends time in the White House library, reading the Bible and reflecting. Meanwhile, the White House remains open to the public, allowing petitioners to come in and seek favors or assistance, a long-standing policy that will come to an end on this very day. After reading scripture, Lincoln briefly reviews a few letters from the nearly 300 he receives daily. However, he is eager to finish his work and head to breakfast, as his son Robert has returned from the war. Robert was present in the room when General Lee surrendered, and Lincoln is eager to hear more details about the event. During breakfast, he expresses his belief that lasting peace has finally arrived. Lincoln also reminds his wife, Mary, about their planned carriage ride later that day. Turning to Robert, he tells him it's time to focus on his education and go to college. After breakfast, Lincoln resumes his presidential duties, but the author highlights the almost symbolic nature of his morning routine. It seems as though he is unknowingly putting his affairs in order. Meanwhile, Throughout Washington, speculation about Lincoln's assassination is growing. Many believe that his death is not a question of if but when. Part 3, Chapter 28 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 9 a.m. John Wilkes Booth meets with Lucy Hale to formally end their engagement. Since their strained trip to Newport, they haven't spoken, and Booth wants to say goodbye while keeping his true intentions hidden. Despite everything, he still cares for her and wishes to part on good terms. Before leaving, he asks for a picture of her, which she willingly gives him. This photograph will later be discovered on his body after his death. Chapter 29 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10 a.m. Mary Lincoln has tickets for Aladdin, or The Wonderful Lamp, a grand play at Grover's Theatre celebrating the Union's victory. However, she also learns that our American cousin is playing at Ford's Theatre, possibly featuring the final performance of the legendary actress Laura Keene. Despite Ford's Theatre struggling with low ticket sales due to the war, Mary decides to attend our American cousin, eager for a social outing after the war's conclusion. Her choice sets off a series of fateful coincidences. Our American Cousin was performed at the start of Lincoln's presidency, symbolizing both its beginning and tragic end. Though Lincoln has no desire to see the play, he doesn't want to upset Mary, who is emotionally fragile after losing 2 children. Known for her strong personality, she is mockingly called Madam President, a title she enjoys. Lincoln agrees to go and informs Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, anticipating his disapproval. Stanton, aware of assassination rumors, had already warned General Grant against attending a play the previous night. He tries to dissuade Lincoln as well, but when Lincoln insists, Stanton urges him to at least bring a guard. The author notes that this moment suggests Stanton wasn't part of the conspiracy. If he were, he wouldn't have recommended protection. Lincoln then invites Stanton and Major Eckert to join him at the theater, but both refuse. Part 3, Chapter 30 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:30 a.m. At 10:30 a.m. Lincoln's message confirming his attendance at our American cousin reaches Ford's Theatre. Excited by the news, owner James Ford scrambles to prepare for the president's visit. Ticket sales for the play have been sluggish, especially compared to Aladdin at Grover's Theatre, but Lincoln's presence is sure to draw a crowd. Ford's Theatre was once the First Baptist Church before James's brother, John Ford, bought it and converted it into a playhouse called Ford's Athenaeum. After a devastating fire, widely believed to be divine intervention, John rebuilt it, reopening in August 1863 as Washington, D.C.'s premier theater. The venue is conveniently located between 2 taverns. As James Ford discusses Lincoln's visit with stage carpenter James J. Gifford, John Wilkes Booth, who uses Ford's Theatre as his mailing address, arrives to pick up his mail. Overhearing their conversation, Booth realizes this is his opportunity. With Lincoln's attendance confirmed, he decides he will assassinate the president that night inside the theater. Booth now faces what the author calls the traditional assassin's plight, not just the act of murder but the challenge of escape. Fortunately for Booth, he knows the theater inside and out and is well trusted as a renowned actor. He begins scouting the theater for his plan, eventually noticing a music stand in the state box. This observation sparks an idea. The chapter closes with the suggestion that Booth isn't just focused on killing Lincoln, he is also contemplating whether he can commit the perfect crime and secure his legacy as a historical figure. Part 3, Chapter 31 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 11 a.m. Good Friday celebrations are taking place across the country, including a major event in Fort Sumter, where the flag is raised to symbolize the war's end and the reunification of the Union. In Washington, D.C., General Grant heads to the White House for a cabinet meeting with Lincoln. Grant is torn. He is supposed to accompany the Lincolns to the theater that night, but his wife, Julia, insists they leave immediately for home to be with their children. Julia also dislikes Mary Lincoln, whom she considers unstable. While Grant feels loyal to Lincoln, he also wants to avoid upsetting his wife. At the meeting, Grant notices how Lincoln leads with ease, treating everyone as equals rather than asserting his authority as president. Grant arrives during the second hour, just as Lincoln planned, bringing renewed energy to the discussion. Lincoln has Grant recount Lee's surrender, reinforcing his own argument for leniency toward the South. His strategy works, swaying the cabinet members toward his vision rather than the harsher approach favored by Vice President Andrew Johnson. Initially, Grant decides to go to the theater after all, planning to leave Washington early the next morning. However, As the meeting drags on, Julia sends a telegram insisting he return home immediately. She even books them a slower train to ensure their departure. Grant informs Lincoln that he won't be able to attend the performance, despite Lincoln's attempts to persuade him otherwise. Part 3, Chapter 32 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 2 p.m. The authors draw parallels between Lincoln's assassination and the mystery surrounding the death of Jesus Christ, noting how unusual events, such as absent guards and delayed telegrams, fuel conspiracy theories. Regardless, Booth is finalizing his plan in these crucial hours. Dressed in black, Booth first stops at Mary Surratt's boarding house, handing her a spyglass with instructions to keep it dry. A boarder, Louis Weichman, grows suspicious and tries to eavesdrop, but Mary sends him away to fetch horses. By the time he returns, Booth has already left for Herndon House to meet Lewis Powell, who is assigned to kill the bedridden Secretary of State, William Seward. Booth reminds Powell that while Seward himself is weak, he'll need to get past the nurse, Seward's wife, and their children. Powell, mentally impaired from a past injury, coldly states that he has no issue killing everyone in the house. Booth then heads to Pumphrey's stable to secure his escape horse. As the city celebrates, he rides through Pennsylvania Avenue, disrupting the crowds. He briefly stops at Grover's Theater before heading to Deary's Tavern, where he reviews his plan. He knows the odds of success are slim but fears that if he does manage to kill Lincoln, people might not realize it was him. To ensure credit, Booth writes a letter to the National Intelligencer, openly confessing to the crime and naming his co-conspirators. He entrusts it to actor John Matthews, instructing him to mail it in the morning unless Booth retrieves it first. By doing so, Booth unknowingly implicates Matthews. While leaving, Booth and Matthews spot General Grant's carriage departing. Booth rides up but does nothing, only glaring at the couple. Julia Grant later recalls the unsettling stare of a horrible man as they left Washington. Booth soon learns that Grant will be absent that night, eliminating one of his main targets and dampening his spirits. Booth then arrives at Ford's Theater, where he practices his escape, riding his horse up and down the street, an action unnoticed except by a maid who sees him from Baptist Alley. Afterward, he invites stagehands for drinks at Greenback Saloon, greets its owner, and finally returns to the National Hotel. The hotel clerk notes his pale and sickly appearance, likely a combination of the alcohol he's consumed and the weight of the act he is about to commit. Part 3, Chapter 33 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 3:30 p.m. As Lincoln walks to the War Department for a meeting with Secretary Seward about a Confederate ringleader, he confides in his bodyguard, William Crook, expressing his belief that someone will eventually succeed in taking his life. Although he feels confident that his assailants will not escape, he acknowledges the difficulty in preventing someone determined to kill him. Lincoln later asks Seward and Major Eckert to accompany him to the theater, but both decline, which leaves Lincoln feeling hurt. He tells Crook that he doesn't want to go to the theater, speaking as if he were facing a death sentence. Despite his reluctance, Lincoln is soon pulled into a meeting with New Hampshire Congressman Edward H. Rollins and other petitioners. He is keenly aware of the time, not wanting to anger Mary by being late for their carriage ride. Finally, he meets her, and the two take a ride in an open carriage. The war has taken its toll on both of them, and they have spent little time together recently. The atmosphere in the carriage is somewhat tentative, but Mary finds joy in seeing Lincoln in a lighter mood. Lincoln, relieved that the war is over, opens up about their future, something he rarely does. He tells her of his plans to retire and return to Illinois once his work is done. Their ride takes them to the Navy Yard, where Lincoln boards the USS Montauk. The crew greets him enthusiastically, but Lincoln and Mary must soon leave to prepare for the theater. Part 3, Chapter 34 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 7 p.m. William Crook, Lincoln's bodyguard, is set to be replaced by John Parker, a policeman known for his lateness and questionable reliability. Parker accompanies Lincoln to various events and reflects on the advice from the head of Lincoln's security detail, who had warned that the president should avoid going out at night, especially to the theater. However, it is well known that Lincoln will attend the play that evening, as the newspapers have made it public. Though Lincoln is deeply unpopular and considered by many to be the most hated man in America, he doesn't dwell on the animosity directed toward him. Mary, on the other hand, is second-guessing the night out, but Lincoln feels a sense of duty to the people who expect to see him at the performance. The Rathbones, Major Henry Reed Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, have been arranged to join them at the theater, replacing the Grants. As Crook contemplates whether inviting Rathbone was the right decision, Parker finally arrives, much later than expected. Despite his many past disciplinary issues, Parker still retains his position as a policeman. When Crook bids Lincoln good night, Lincoln responds with a final goodbye instead, which deeply unsettles Crook and lingers with him throughout the night. Part 3, Chapter 35 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 8 p.m. At the same time that Lincoln bids Crook farewell, Booth is dining at the National Hotel, preparing for the night ahead. The play at Ford's Theater is set to start at 8 p.m. and Booth's plan to kill Lincoln will unfold shortly after 10 p.m. In high spirits, Booth drinks to calm his nerves and gather liquid courage for what is to come. His plan is to kill Lincoln during the third act of Our American Cousin, when actor Harry Hawk delivers a line that always garners laughter from the audience. At this moment, when the theater erupts in laughter, Booth will shoot Lincoln. He will be positioned in the state box, so all he needs to do is draw his Derringer pistol, and he will use his Bowie knife if necessary to fight his way out. Afterward, he will leap over the railing, exit through the backstage door, and flee to Maryland and later to Mexico. Booth also plans to shout the phrase, Sic semper tyrannis, meaning, death to tyrants, the Virginia state motto, as he carries out the assassination. Before leaving for Ford's Theater, Booth returns to his room to retrieve his knife and pistol. He packs a small bag with essentials and purposely leaves behind some items in his room, such as a scrap of paper with Confederate codes connecting him to Jefferson Davis in Richmond and the Confederate Gold Fund in Montreal, as well as a valise implicating both John Surratt and his mother, Mary. Booth's reasoning is that if he is killed or captured, he wants others involved in the conspiracy to be held accountable, and he wants to ensure that he will be recognized as the mastermind of the plot. He then heads to Ford's Theater and has a drink at the attached tavern. There, he speaks with the orchestra director, who comments that Booth will never be as successful as his father. Booth responds confidently, saying, "When I leave the stage, I will be the most talked about man in America." Part 3, Chapter 36 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 8:05 p.m. Lincoln's meeting with Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax runs long, and Mary interrupts, reminding him of their plans for the night at the theater. Lincoln finally acknowledges her concerns, and the two leave the White House. Their carriage picks up the Rathbones and heads through the city's celebrations to Ford's Theater. Mary is thrilled to see Lincoln in such a good mood. Lincoln enters the theater at 8:25 p.m. and the couples, accompanied by John Parker, make their way to the state box. Upon his arrival, actress Laura Keene ad-libs a line to inform the audience that Lincoln has arrived, and orchestra director William Withers, who had previously shared a drink with Booth, pauses the production to play "Hail to the Chief." The audience rises and cheers for Lincoln, who sits in the rocking chair provided for him, mostly concealed by a curtain. Although somewhat controversial, Lincoln holds hands with Mary as they take their seats. There is only one route in and out of the state box. On the other side of the door is an unlit hallway, and at the end of the hallway, there's another door. John Parker, tasked with guarding the door to ensure no one enters or exits, becomes thirsty during the performance and leaves to visit Talteville's saloon. Footman Charles Forbes joins him. What's more shocking is that Parker, despite his long history of career missteps and disciplinary actions, will not face any punishment for this severe act of negligence. Part 3, Chapter 37 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 8:45 p.m. While Lincoln settles into the state box, Booth is outside Herndon House, going over the plan one last time with his co-conspirators. He stresses that the assassination of the president will occur precisely at 10:15 p.m. and the other killings must happen at that exact time as well. Booth aims to create chaos and panic across Washington, D.C., making it appear as if the city is under attack by multiple assassins. This confusion will help him and his fellow conspirators escape unnoticed. Lewis Powell and David Harold are assigned to murder Secretary of State Seward. Powell will pose as someone delivering a bottle of medicine to Seward, allowing him to gain entry to the house. Harold's role is to help Powell escape after the murder. George Atzerodt is tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. Booth also reveals to the group that he has written a letter to the National Intelligencer, implicating all of them in the plot. This letter serves as a reminder to the conspirators that they are all in this together and that backing out is not an option. Part 3, Chapter 38 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 9:30 p.m. Booth arrives at Ford's Theater and calls for Ned Spangler, a scene changer who works there. Spangler is hesitant to help, fearing he could lose his job, so he sends Joseph Burroughs, a young boy who does odd jobs at the theater, to hold Booth's horse instead. Booth then enters the theater, making sure to greet everyone as he walks through. He checks the tunnel beneath the stage that leads to the back door to ensure his escape route is clear and unobstructed. Once satisfied, he exits the theater and heads to Taltaville's saloon. At the saloon, Booth orders a bottle of whiskey and is pleased to see that Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, is there drinking as well. At exactly 10 p.m. Booth leaves the saloon to carry out his plan. Part 3, Chapter 39 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10 p.m. As the third act begins, Lincoln dons his signature overcoat, which bears the message, "One country, one destiny." At 7:07 p.m. he pulls back the privacy curtain to glance at the crowd. Meanwhile, Booth enters Ford's theater, visibly pale but attempting to stay composed. The ticket taker, in awe of Booth's celebrity status, chats with him, noticing his pallor but thinking little of it. Another employee observes that Booth has been in and out of the theater multiple times throughout the day, yet no one is suspicious of his actions. Booth makes his way to the state box. Upon reaching it, he is relieved to see that Lincoln's bodyguard is still in the saloon. He hands his calling card to a White House messenger, who lets him pass without question. A young girl excitedly spots Booth in the wings but is startled when she turns to see Lincoln staring out. She tells the gentleman next to her, Jim Ferguson, the owner of Taltaville's, but when she looks back, Booth is gone. Booth, now in the darkened hallway leading to the state box, is at a crossroads. He could turn back and abandon his mission, but his thoughts return to the Confederate cause and Lincoln's emancipation of slaves. He feels compelled to act, believing he alone can change the course of the nation. Booth wedges a music stand against the door to block anyone from entering and stopping him, having already carved a small hole into the door earlier. Through the hole, he spies on Lincoln. The state box is shaped like a parallelogram, with the Lincoln sitting along the railing and the Rathbones positioned at an angle. Booth, peering through the peephole, prepares himself. As he hears Harry Hawk's line approaching, he readies his weapon. The audience erupts into laughter, and Booth steps into the state box, ready to carry out his plan. Part 3, Chapter 40 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:15 p.m. At 10:15 p.m. Lewis Powell arrives at Secretary of State Seward's home, ready to carry out his mission. The house has its own tragic history, marked by the earlier murder of Philip Barton Key, son of Francis Scott Key. As Powell knocks on the door, a young black servant named William Bell answers. Powell claims to have medicine for Seward, but Bell refuses to let him in, offering to take the medicine himself. Powell aggressively pushes past Bell, using a racial slur and asserting his authority as a white man. Inside, Powell encounters Seward's son, Frederick, who is startled by the commotion and comes to investigate. Upon learning which room his father is in, Powell pretends to comply with Frederick's request to leave the medicine but suddenly attacks. The gun Powell tries to use jams, and a violent struggle ensues between the two. Powell overpowers Frederick, knocking him unconscious. Bell, realizing the danger, flees the house and shouts murder into the night. Harold, Powell's co-conspirator, hears the cries for help and begins to panic. Fearing that soldiers will soon arrive, Harold ties Powell's horse to a tree and escapes on his own horse, abandoning Powell. Meanwhile, Powell, still determined to complete his mission, beats Frederick savagely with the broken gun, leaving him bloodied and unconscious. He then moves on to Seward's room to continue his deadly task. Part 3, Chapter 42 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:15 p.m. George Atzerodt was tasked with assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, yet he spent the night drinking heavily at Kirkwood House, the same hotel where both he and Johnson were staying. Johnson was widely despised by Southerners, who considered him a traitor, especially since he advocated for much harsher punishments against the South than Lincoln did. Despite being a prime target, Johnson remained unharmed, thanks in part to Atzerodt's inability to carry out his mission. Earlier in the evening, Atzerodt picked up his horse from Naylor's stable, the same place where David Harold had rented his. The stable foreman disliked both men but decided to have a drink with Atzerodt to see if he could gather any information about Harold's whereabouts. However, despite being drunk, Atzerodt did not reveal any details. When he finally left the stable, swaying on his horse, the foreman followed him for a short time but eventually lost track of him. Meanwhile, Andrew Johnson dined alone at the hotel, appearing as though he were waiting for some important summons. Like others in the government, he had turned down an invitation to attend Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Largely uneducated, Johnson had been chosen as Lincoln's running mate primarily to appeal to Southern voters. However, his tenure in office would be tumultuous. History would later judge him harshly, branding him with the ignominious title of worst president in history. At 10:15 p.m., the exact time when Booth was scheduled to assassinate Lincoln, Atzerodt returned to Kirkwood House. Johnson was alone in his room, a vulnerable target. Yet instead of carrying out the assassination, Atzerodt remained at the bar, drinking himself into a stupor. He had never truly wanted to commit murder, and the alcohol provided an easy excuse for his inaction. In the end, the vice president's life was spared, not by a lack of planning, but by the assassin's own cowardice and intoxication. Part 3, Chapter 43 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:15 p.m. At the precise moment he planned, Booth steps out of the shadows and fires his Derringer pistol into the back of Lincoln's head, just as the president leans forward. The bullet enters behind Lincoln's left ear, traveling diagonally through his brain and coming to rest above his right eye. Despite this, when an autopsy is later performed, 4 separate doctors will examine Lincoln's corpse and reach different conclusions about the exact nature of the wound. Mary Lincoln immediately notices her husband slump forward, but she does not yet understand what has happened. Major Henry Rathbone, a soldier, instantly recognizes the sound of gunfire. He leaps to his feet, prepared to defend the president. Booth, now wielding his Bowie knife, slashes at Rathbone, cutting him deeply in the arm, so deeply that it reaches the bone. As Booth brandishes his knife, he shouts "Freedom," but the audience is still confused, unsure whether the gunshot and commotion are part of the play. On stage, actor Harry Hawk is alone, staring in shock at the state box. Meanwhile, Booth prepares to make his escape. He attempts to leap onto the stage, a maneuver he has performed flawlessly in countless theatrical performances, but misjudges his jump. His spur gets caught in the flag draped over the state box, and he lands awkwardly, fracturing his left fibula upon impact. The audience remains in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend what has just occurred. Some, including theater manager James Ford, initially believe Booth's actions are part of a dramatic stunt. But as Major Rathbone and Clara Harris begin shouting that the president has been shot, panic erupts. Booth, despite his injury, fights his way off stage. He lashes out at William Withers, the orchestra director, and grapples with a theater carpenter, but ultimately forces his way through the backstage exit. Once outside, he violently kicks and bludgeons Peanut John, the young theater employee holding his horse. Mounting his steed, Booth disappears into the night, blending into the chaos of the crowd as he makes his escape. Part 3, Chapter 44 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:20 p.m. As Booth continues his escape, the joyous victory processions in Washington transform into chaotic, angry mobs. News spreads rapidly. President Lincoln has been shot at Ford's Theater. People rush toward the scene, desperate to confirm the rumors for themselves. Inside the theater, panic still reigns, while at Grover's Theater, another performance is interrupted by the shocking revelation. Among the audience members at Grover's is Lincoln's 12-year-old son, Tad, who is immediately whisked back to the White House for his safety. At the same time, reports begin surfacing that Secretary of State William Seward has also been brutally attacked in his home. The realization dawns that this is not an isolated act of violence but a coordinated assassination plot. Among those who quickly grasp the implications is Michael O'Laughlin, a former Confederate operative and Booth's old friend. Upon hearing the news, O'Laughlin knows he must flee Washington immediately to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, John Fletcher, the stable foreman, spots David Harold galloping past on horseback. Realizing something is amiss, he attempts to stop Harold, but when Harold flees, Fletcher gives chase. Booth, on the other hand, is more cautious. Knowing that a wounded man riding at full speed could draw attention, he walks his horse carefully through the streets, blending into the night. As he nears the Navy Yard Bridge, Booth finally urges his horse into a gallop, eager to put distance between himself and the city. He reaches the bridge at 10:45 p.m. where he is stopped by military sentry Silas T. Cobb. Nighttime crossings are not allowed, and Booth is questioned. Thinking quickly, Booth fabricates a story. He claims he is not from Washington and has simply been waiting for the moon to rise so he can navigate the dark roads ahead. His manner is convincing, and Cobb ultimately lets him pass. Shortly after, Harold arrives at the bridge and is also questioned. Like Booth, he provides an excuse, and remarkably, Cobb allows him to pass as well. Moments later, John Fletcher arrives at the bridge, determined to alert authorities to what he has seen. He spots Booth and Harold in the distance, but Cobb informs him that he cannot re-enter the city until morning. Realizing that spending the night in the unpredictable, lawless Maryland countryside would be too dangerous, Fletcher reluctantly turns back, leaving Booth and Harold to disappear into the darkness. Part 3, Chapter 45 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 10:20 p.m. Inside the state box, President Lincoln is fading fast. Major Henry Rathbone, despite his own severe injury, manages to remove the music stand blocking the door and calls desperately for a doctor. People push their way inside, desperate to see what has happened. The first physician to arrive is Dr. Charles Leal, a young army doctor who has only been practicing medicine for 2 months. Leal quickly assesses Lincoln, but at first, he cannot locate a wound. With no immediate signs of blood, he mistakenly assumes the president has been stabbed. As he continues his examination, he notices that Lincoln's right eye is beginning to bulge, a sign of severe brain trauma. Running his fingers through Lincoln's hair, he finally finds the source of the injury, a gunshot wound behind the left ear. When he removes a blood clot, a rush of blood escapes, relieving the pressure on Lincoln's brain and allowing him to breathe again. Though still inexperienced, Leal works decisively. He attempts to resuscitate Lincoln and, with the help of 2 more senior physicians, Dr. Charles Sabin Taft and Dr. Albert King, begins efforts to stimulate the president's breathing. Leal even administers an early form of CPR, and his methods seem to work. Lincoln begins to breathe on his own. The crowd dares to hope, but Leal already recognizes the devastating truth: Lincoln's brain has stopped functioning. He solemnly announces that there is no chance for survival. As the realization sets in, some men remove their hats in silent mourning, while others are so overcome with grief that they vomit. Meanwhile, the theater below is still in a state of chaos. Mary Lincoln, overwhelmed with shock and horror, remains by her husband's side. Suddenly, Laura Keene, the lead actress of Our American Cousin, forces her way into the state box. She asks permission to cradle Lincoln's head in her lap, and surprisingly, she is allowed to do so. The moment is both tender and opportunistic. Keene is not without ulterior motives. As the woman who held the dying president, she will be immortalized in newspaper illustrations and history books. Part 3, Chapter 46 Summary, Friday, April 14, 1865 Washington, D.C. 11 p.m. This moment is one of both urgency and sorrow. The doctors know Lincoln cannot survive much longer, but they are determined to give him a dignified place to pass. The decision to carry him by hand is a testament to the care and respect given to him in his final hours. The scene outside the theater is chaotic, with crowds gathering, some in shock, others in mourning. As Lincoln is carried across the street to the Peterson house, the irony of the location, where Booth himself had once stayed, adds a haunting layer to the tragedy. Mary Lincoln's plea, "Live, you must live," is heartbreaking. She knows, deep down, that her husband is slipping away, but her desperation is palpable. The president who guided the nation through its darkest times now lay dying, surrounded by doctors, but beyond saving. Part 3, Chapter 47 Summary, Saturday, April 15, 1865 Washington, D.C. Midnight to dawn. This final stretch of Lincoln's life is both tragic and awe-inspiring. His body clings to life longer than expected, a testament to his resilience, even in death. The constant care from the doctors, especially Leal's quiet dedication, shows a deep respect for the fallen leader. Stanton's presence shifts the focus from Lincoln's final moments to the beginning of a nationwide reckoning. His words, "Now he belongs to the ages," immortalize Lincoln's legacy, marking the moment when a man becomes a martyr. As the sun rises over Washington, the city, and the country, must now come to terms with the loss of the men who held the Union together. Part 4, The Chase, Afterward. Part 4, Chapter 48 Summary, Saturday, April 15, 1865 Maryland countryside, early morning. Booth and Harold manage to escape into the Maryland countryside, though there is no sign of Powell or Atzerodt. However, Booth's severe injury forces them to seek refuge at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Confederate sympathizer and physician. Meanwhile, authorities are still piecing together what happened, with Booth as the only clear suspect. The first major lead they find is Atzerodt. He had discarded his knife and avoided returning to his room, knowing he had been seen with Booth's horse. At 3 a.m. he checks into the Pennsylvania hotel, where he shares a room with Lieutenant Kime. Though intoxicated, Atzerodt feigns sadness about Lincoln's assassination, fooling the lieutenant. However, detectives assigned to protect Vice President Andrew Johnson later search his room, discovering a ledger book from the Ontario Bank in Montreal with Booth's name on it, directly linking him to the assassin. They also uncover weapons and additional evidence tying Atzerodt to the conspiracy. As a result, arrest warrants are issued for both Atzerodt and Booth. An anonymous tip sends soldiers to Mary Surratt's boarding house. While no incriminating evidence is found, her suspicious behavior prompts investigators to monitor her closely. Another lead takes them to Booth's room, where they uncover further proof that he did not act alone. After questioning the staff at Seward's residence, authorities add 2 more suspects to the growing list, bringing the total to 6. John Surratt also falls under suspicion due to his mother's association with the case. Washington, D.C. quickly shifts from a city of celebration to one of mourning. Flags are lowered to half-mast, and Andrew Johnson is sworn in as the 17th president. Meanwhile, Seward remains in a coma but regains consciousness on Easter Sunday. Upon seeing the city in mourning and realizing Lincoln has not come to visit, he understands that his friend has died. Ford's Theater, once a place of entertainment, becomes a symbol of tragedy and soon closes. The cast of Our American Cousin fears for their safety, staying indoors. Actor Harry Hawk is even arrested for having been on stage with Booth when he delivered his infamous declaration. As Lincoln had feared, the nation appears on the verge of another civil war. While the North demands justice, the South celebrates. Determined to restore order, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton launches the largest manhunt in the nation's history. He aims to flush the conspirators out of hiding and enlists the help of his former spymaster, Lafayette Baker, whose questionable ties to Confederate sympathizers raise concerns. Meanwhile, Atzerodt wakes up, realizing he must flee. He sells his pistol and boards a carriage out of town, trying to remain inconspicuous. His low-profile demeanor works, as even when Union soldiers stop the carriage, they allow him to continue into Maryland without suspicion. Part 4, Chapter 49 Summary, Saturday, April 15, 1865 Maryland countryside, noon. Dr. Samuel Mudd treats Booth, who is suffering from a fractured left foot, severe pain, and a hangover. On top of his physical ailments, Booth is now experiencing the fear of being a fugitive for the first time. He and Harold had ridden through the night, stopping only at a tavern owned by Mary Surratt to retrieve guns she had hidden for them. While there, Harold openly admitted to the Confederate proprietor that they had just assassinated Lincoln. Had it not been for Booth's injury, they might have reached the Potomac River without delay. However, his worsening condition forced them to stop. The author highlights how Booth's demeanor has changed. His usual confidence seemed shaken after killing Lincoln. Although they rely on his sharp mind to navigate their escape, Booth is now physically weakened and increasingly dependent on Harold. With his leg in a splint, his mobility is further restricted, leaving him able to ride with only one leg. Part 4, Chapter 50 Summary, Saturday through Sunday, April 15 to 16, 1865 New York City, morning. Baker is in New York when he learns of Lincoln's assassination. Feeling disgraced, he quickly considers how to turn the tragedy to his advantage. Soon after, he receives a direct order from Stanton to return to Washington, D.C. and find the murderer of our president, 246. The author suggests that Baker may have misinterpreted this command, believing his role was not just to capture Booth but possibly to kill him or act as a high-profile spy. Interestingly, Stanton seems to know exactly where Baker is at all times. Upon Baker's return, he is granted complete control over the investigation, despite the presence of other law enforcement agencies already working on the case. There is documented evidence linking Baker and Booth through an address in New York, yet Baker insists he has no knowledge of Booth. Nevertheless, he takes swift action, offering a reward for Booth and his accomplices and distributing wanted posters with their images across the region. Part 4, Chapter 51 Summary, Saturday through Sunday, April 15 to 16, 1865 Maryland countryside. David Harold realizes that Booth needs a buggy for transportation, but Dr. Mudd refuses to lend him one. Though Mudd supports the Confederacy, he fears being implicated if fugitives are seen using his personal carriage. He suggests they go to Bryantown to gather supplies instead. However, as they approach the town, Harold hesitates, sensing that his unfamiliar presence might draw suspicion. His instincts prove correct. Union cavalry has surrounded Bryantown, questioning residents and preventing anyone from leaving. The author highlights Harold's natural ability to sense danger and make quick decisions. With no other option, Booth and Harold set out for the Zekiah Swamp, an ideal hiding spot with treacherous bogs, quicksand, and dense forest. However, they lose their way and are forced to return to Mudd's farm, deciding to try again the next day. That night, they camp in a grove of trees, waiting for a signal from a contact who is supposed to help them escape. This man is someone they met while visiting a Confederate sympathizer who still owns 40 enslaved people. Harold briefly worries it could be a trap, but when he hears the signal, he is relieved to find Thomas Jones, a fellow Confederate supporter, ready to assist them. Part 4, Chapter 52 Summary, Monday, April 17, 1865 Maryland Swamps. Thomas Jones is an experienced smuggler who secretly transports people and goods along the Potomac River. His skills are so refined that even Northern newspapers relied on him to bypass blockades and distribute their papers in the South during the war. Jones visits Booth and Harold twice, bringing food and, on his second visit, newspapers. He warns them that Union cavalry is actively searching for them and that they must be patient, as their escape may take longer than expected. When Jones departs, Booth eagerly scans the newspapers, expecting to see himself celebrated for his actions. Instead, he is devastated to find that even Southern publications condemn him as a coward and criminal. Enraged, he vents to Harold, insisting that Lincoln was responsible for all of the country's problems and that God had merely used him as an instrument of divine justice. Part 4, Chapter 53 Summary, Monday, April 17, 1865 Mary Surratt's boarding house, night. Mary Surratt remains a prime suspect, as authorities have been watching her since the night of Lincoln's assassination. Lewis Weichman, a boarder at her house who had disliked Booth from the start, provides key information about Booth and other conspirators meeting at Surratt's home, reinforcing the belief that it was a central location for the plot. This testimony directly implicates Mary Surratt. As detectives surround the house and take Mary and her daughter Anna into custody, an unexpected visitor arrives, Lewis Powell. Realizing his mistake too late, Powell tries to give a false name, but investigators quickly become suspicious when they notice blood on his clothes. They arrest him and search his belongings, discovering items such as a clipping of Lincoln's second inaugural address. To confirm his identity, they bring in William Bell, Seward's servant, who immediately recognizes Powell. Authorities then restrain Powell with a ball and chain and later place a canvas hood over his head, leaving only a small hole for eating and breathing. Part 4, Chapter 54 Summary, Tuesday, April 18, 1865 Maryland Swamps, Day and Night. The cavalry expands its search across the Maryland countryside, pushing into the treacherous swamps. However, the soldiers are reluctant to wade into the foul waters, and tragically, 87 men drown while scouring the area for Booth and Harold. Authorities arrest anyone displaying anti-Union sentiments or behaving suspiciously. Meanwhile, Lafayette Baker intensifies the manhunt, dispatching a telegraph operator to Point Lookout to streamline communications during the pursuit. Part 4, Chapter 55 Summary, Tuesday, April 18, 1865 Maryland Countryside, Afternoon. The cavalry unit arrives at Dr. Samuel Mudd's home. Mudd had previously confided in his cousin George, a Union sympathizer, that two men had stayed at his house on the night of Lincoln's assassination. Dr. Mudd had hoped George would report this to the authorities, believing they would view him as an innocent man caught in a dangerous situation, rather than as a co-conspirator. However, George bypasses the police and takes the information directly to the military. Lieutenant Alex Lovett interrogates Mudd, and his story begins to unravel. Despite having rehearsed his account, Mudd contradicts himself. Although Lovett doesn't arrest him immediately, he continues to search for evidence linking Mudd to Booth. Part 4, Chapter 56 Summary, Thursday, April 20, 1865 Maryland Countryside, 4 a.m. Surratt devises an escape plan that takes him northeast, deeper into pro-Union territory, which is a brilliant strategy of hiding in plain sight. However, he makes several critical errors. He fails to maintain constant movement, and one evening, while drunk at dinner, he carelessly supports Lincoln's assassination. U.S. Marshals catch wind of this and soon arrive at his cousin's house in Germantown, Maryland. Surratt surrenders without resistance and is taken into custody. He is shackled, hooded, and ultimately hanged 3 months later, despite not actually harming anyone or even intending to be part of the assassination plot. Part 4, Chapter 57 Summary, Friday, April 21, 1865 Washington, D.C. 7 a.m. Lincoln's funeral procession begins under the supervision of Ulysses S. Grant, with his body and that of his late son, Willie, being placed on a train bound for Illinois. Despite Lincoln's desire for a modest burial, his casket will be opened 6 times and moved 17 times over the next 150 years. The body, preserved through extensive embalming, is nearly mummified. The funeral takes place on Wednesday, April 19, and Mary Lincoln, still overwhelmed by grief, moves out of the White House on May 22. After the funeral, Lincoln's body is paraded through the streets of Washington, D.C. before beginning its final journey to Illinois. This event becomes known as the greatest funeral in the history of the United States. Items related to the assassination, including the Derringer bullet, the probe used to retrieve it, and the rocking chair in which Lincoln was shot, will eventually be displayed in a museum. Part 4, Chapter 58 Summary, Friday, April 21, 1865 Maryland countryside, noon. Lieutenant Lovett returns to Dr. Samuel Mudd's home to continue his questioning. Once again, Mudd provides unsatisfactory answers, prompting Lovett to request a search of the house. Mudd's wife, Sarah, retrieves several items, including a boot and a razor that one of the perpetrators had used to shave off his beard. Lovett presses Mudd again about the identities of the 2 men, and Mudd insists he doesn't know them. Lovett then points to the boot, which has been altered to reveal the inside clearly marked with J. Wilkes. At this point, Dr. Samuel Mudd is arrested. Meanwhile, Lafayette Baker learns about the abandoned boot and correctly concludes that Booth cannot be traveling by horseback and that his escape options are now limited, particularly to the Potomac River. Baker surmises that Booth is likely heading for the mountains of Kentucky, which he believes is his destination. Baker assumes Booth will land in Port Tobacco, although his deduction is only slightly off. Part 4, Chapter 59 Summary, Friday, April 21, 1865 Maryland swamps, night. Booth and Harold have been hiding in the swamps for 6 days. Booth, once confident and proud after killing Lincoln, is now miserable and weary. Accustomed to a life of comfort, he is disheartened by their current situation. When they prepare to rest for the night, they hear a whistle. Jones arrives with news that it's time for them to make their move. They pass by Jones's home, and Booth asks to come in and warm up, but Jones warns them that his slaves might inform the authorities, so they continue toward the Potomac River, where they can see Virginia, a pro-Confederate area, across the water. However, the river's currents are tricky, and Union boats patrol the river to intercept smugglers. The goal is to reach Matchadock Creek, where Mrs. Queensbury will help them. Though Jones assists Booth and Harold, he is disgusted by what Booth has done, and later, he avoids punishment because testimony against him, given by a non-white Maryland resident, is ignored. Booth and Harold start their journey, but they realize they're heading in the wrong direction. They almost collide with the federal gunboat Juniper before they return to Maryland. A day later, they try again and successfully cross into Virginia, with Kentucky as their next destination. Part 4, Chapter 60 Summary, Monday through Tuesday, April 24 to 25, 1865, Virginia-Maryland border, day. A telegraph operator in Port Tobacco sends false information claiming that Booth and Harold have crossed the river. Although the men who crossed are not Booth and Harold, Lafayette Baker dispatches cavalry, led by his cousin, Lieutenant Luther Baker, and Colonel Everton Conger, to track them down. Despite the difference in rank, Baker places his cousin in charge. The group first travels to Belle Plaine, Virginia, but finds no leads. They then head to Port Conway, where their search proves fruitless. Exhausted from riding through the day and night, Lieutenant Baker hands command back to Colonel Conger. Just as they prepare to leave and catch their return ship, they receive word that Booth and Harold were positively identified at Port Royal's ferry crossing, where they passed with a small group of Confederates the previous day. Despite their fatigue, the soldiers ride out once more, arriving at a farm at 2 a.m. They surround the farm, though they have no solid proof that Booth and Harold are inside. Part 4, Chapter 61 Summary, Wednesday, April 26, 1865 Garrett Farm, Virginia, dusk to dawn. Booth regains some of his earlier confidence after finding refuge with Southerners, enjoying more comforts and being surrounded by people who are sympathetic to his cause. Although he confides in Southern soldiers about his true identity, he presents himself to others, including the Garrett family, as a wounded soldier returning from Petersburg. However, word reaches them that Federal cavalry have crossed the Rappahannock River. This news visibly shakes Booth, prompting the Garretts to grow suspicious. They ask him and Harold to leave, but the two refuse and are instead given shelter in the barn. Concerned that the men might steal their horses, William and John Garrett sleep outside the barn with pistols. At 2 a.m. the dogs start barking, and John Garrett enters the barn, telling Booth and Harold to surrender as the barn is surrounded. Booth, enraged, tells John to leave and accuses him of betrayal. John Garrett flees, locking the barn door behind him. Harold then admits he wants to surrender, angering Booth. Booth shouts that Harold is betraying him, and Harold leaves, ultimately being arrested. Lieutenant Baker threatens to burn the barn, and Booth, continuing his dramatic behavior, demands that a stretcher be prepared for him, saying, "One more stain on the old banner." Historians are unsure what he meant by this statement. The barn is set on fire, and as Booth sees Baker entering, he takes aim but is shot in the neck by Sergeant Boston Corbett, who paralyzes him with the bullet. Corbett, a religious zealot, had previously castrated himself in a misguided act after experiencing lust. Booth, too injured to escape, dies by morning. His body is thrown into a wagon, and the actor-turned-assassin dies at just 26 years old. Part 4, Chapter 62 Summary, Friday, July 7, 1865 Washington, D.C. Dawn. The hunt for Lincoln's killers continues to dominate public attention. Secretary of War Stanton takes full control of the investigation, pushing Lafayette Baker aside. While some in the South revere Booth as a martyr and display his pictures, the majority of the country seeks justice, wanting those responsible for the assassination to be brought to account. Mary Surratt remains in prison as one of the key suspects. The trial for the conspirators begins on May 10. Though the evidence against them seems overwhelming, Mary Surratt garners some sympathy, with a few people questioning whether she should be spared. In prison, Mary undergoes a physical and emotional transformation. She suffers from severe female health issues, including excessive menstruation and endometriosis, compounded by the deplorable conditions in jail. All of the prisoners face similar hardships, battling bloating, sweating, and skin ailments. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury finds Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold guilty, sentencing them all to death by hanging. Michael O'Laughlin, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Ned Spangler, and Samuel Arnold are sentenced to imprisonment. Mary Surratt's priest, along with others, comes to her defense, arguing that as a woman simply trying to survive, she should not face execution. Her daughter also defends her, and her lawyer attempts to meet with President Andrew Johnson to plead for her life, but he is repeatedly blocked. Mary remains hopeful that she will be spared, even on the morning of July 7. She still believes she will be pardoned. However, she is led to the gallows along with Powell, Atzerodt, and Harold. Powell proclaims his innocence as they are prepared for execution. Their crimes are read aloud in alphabetical order before the signal is given, and the trapdoors are released. While the men die instantly, Mary's neck does not break immediately. She struggles for 5 minutes before finally succumbing to the hanging. She becomes the first and only woman ever hanged by the United States government.